Good evening, everyone. My name is Max Young, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore for tuning in tonight. Tonight, we are lucky to have with us Jordan Blashek and Christopher Haugh, authors of the book Union, A Democrat, a Republican, and a Search for Common Ground. They'll be in discussion tonight, and it'll be moderated by Army veteran and former congressional candidate Tony Woods. Again, we're so grateful that you could join us tonight and continue supporting us during this time. If you want to ask Jordan and Chris questions, you can go ahead and click the Ask a Question button down there, and we'll be answering those throughout the talk. And lastly, if you want to support the two authors as well as our bookstore, you can go ahead and click the green button down there to go ahead and purchase their book. But with that all being said, I'll go ahead and let them take the screen. Thanks, y'all.
Hi, guys. Welcome. Let's see. So again, I'm Tony Woods. It is my pleasure to moderate tonight's book talk with my two friends, Jordan and Chris. So Union is a book that essentially answers the question, what happens when a liberal and a conservative decide to jump into an old Volvo and drive across the country? That's the question at the heart of this book, Union, a Democrat, a Republican, and a Search for Common Ground by the friends Jordan Blashek and Chris Haugh. Jordan is a businessman, he's my coworker, conservative and a former Marine from Encino, California. Chris is a Democratic speechwriter and journalist from Berkeley, California. This unlikely pair met at law school and quickly became friends, but they couldn't stop arguing about politics, and in 2016, those arguments got worse and worse. So they decided to take a road trip to see America and understand different perspectives. Then they did it again and again and again. So Union is a story of their friendship and how that friendship changed the way they see themselves. It's also the story of the people that they met and the lessons that they learned about what it means to be an American. In the end, Union is a story about hope for a better future, and for a better United States. So I'll offer a warm virtual welcome to both Chris and Jordan and give you a moment to say hello to the audience.
Hi, everyone. Tony, thank you so much for the introduction. It's so fun to do this with you. And thank you, everyone, for joining. We're excited for this.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. This is exciting. And thank you, Jordan and Tony, for staying up late for this, you guys being out on the East Coast and all.
Great. Very much happy to do it. All right, everyone, let's go ahead and dive right in. So you mentioned, and you actually talk about this actually quite eloquently in the foreword, but on the surface, it's possible that somebody might say, look, that you have far more similarities than you do differences. A cynic who would shout, what can two straight white guys from California possibly differ on? So I'm wondering if you guys can maybe push back on this notion a little bit and tell us about yourselves. Why both of you see the world differently, what shaped some of those experiences that cause you to see things differently, and perhaps why you found yourselves regularly disagreeing.
Yeah, of course. Tony, thank you for the question. So I think the truth is, like, superficially, Chris and I are very similar. We're two straight white guys from California. And I think at a deeper level, we're also very similar. And it was those similarities that initially drew us in and made us feel that there was actually this great friendship here. So when we first met at Yale Law School, we bonded over things like our shared love for great literature and reporting. And Chris wanted to be a war journalist, and I had just come from a war zone. We also talked about the influence of our mothers and how they kind of shaped our sense of values and character. And so all these early things kind of bound us together. And so the similarities were actually very powerful in making us friends. But I think it also quickly became evident that we had very different worldviews. And those were probably products of our upbringing. So I grew up in a Republican family. After 9/11, my mother started a nonprofit that sent care packages to troops. So I grew up kind of sending packages to troops who were going overseas. Chris's upbringing was different. And I think those differences, I'll let Chris talk to the differences, but I think those early experiences were sort of formative for us. So I think in my household, we had dinner conversations every night about Republican policies and that sort of worldview. And so it's inevitable that kind of shaped how I saw things. But yeah, I'd be curious for Chris's.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I like to say that we isolated a variable in many ways. We are very similar in so many facets. As Jordan and Tony eloquently put, we're both from California, both straight white guys. There's a lot there, but we disagree and come from very different political backgrounds, and that was enough to both have the background to write together, but also have something to disagree about, to probe. And I think if we had too much that was different, at least in terms of our worldviews, I think it'd be a lot harder to get a project like this done. In terms of my background, and this is hard, I've got two people to fact check me because I've actually known Tony since I was 19. But I'm from Berkeley, California. I was raised by a mom who's an activist who shut down her college campus in the 70s. I went to Iraq War protests. I grew up reading Black Panther literature in high school. So we come from very different backgrounds in terms of our political influences and first principles. And in 2015, politics actually didn't seem all that prominent. So we were actually able to build this friendship, like Jordan said, on these other things. It wasn't until 2016 that it started to feel like this friendship maybe was transgressive or not something that was socially acceptable or that we should be doing. And that was when the book and the project really sort of took flight.
And just one quick follow-up on that, which is, we talked early about our mothers being this big influence on our lives and character. I think there's this like hilarious symmetry that, like, growing up, my mom was sending care packages while Chris's mom was protesting the Iraq War, and we actually had a chance to have our moms meet almost exactly a year ago when the book finished, and they're now great friends. Both of them have not missed a single book talk, so they're a huge influence on our lives.
That's really cool. And what I love about these sort of them bonding over, or both of those experiences, you can almost say protesting the war or sending troops care packages is both out of a common sense of love for that individual and for the well-being of people who serve, which is a really nice thing. So let's dive in a little further. So it sounds like you've described some real stark differences. As a person who has suffered through many arguments with Chris on the road, Jordan, I almost want to know, like, what inspired the both of you to spend hundreds of hours traveling the country, trapped in a car together. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the road trips that animate the story, and maybe what you hope to find on these journeys.
Yeah, so Chris and I, we met in 2015. I was the second year, Chris was the first year at Yale Law School, and we were introduced by someone. We ended up meeting for a drink that was meant to be 30 minutes, and it ended up being 3 hours. And over the course of the next 8 months, we developed this great friendship. But as 2016 got closer, we found that we were talking about politics all the time, and those conversations ended with one of us kind of red in the face, and everyone around us was talking about politics. And towards the end of the year, it was getting so divisive. And Chris and I both started kind of pulling back from those conversations over time because we never felt like they got anywhere. And I had to be in LA for my sister's wedding at the end of the year. And one night while we were sitting, listening to people shouting around us, I leaned over to Chris and said, "Hey man, would you want to go on a road trip with me?" And that first road trip together, I think we were both nervous. We were still new friends. Being together for 7 days, knowing that we would probably fight about politics was a little unnerving. But on the road, you just find that the country is so beautiful. There's something magical to the American highways and the national parks. And we had time and space to have these great conversations. And we also fought. We fought really hard. But the beauty of a car is that you're stuck there. And so after you fight, you have to kind of reconcile and then think a bit deeper about what the fight was really about. And we realized that we were actually getting to these deeper values we both held and having better conversations. So as we headed into 2017, we just decided there was something important about getting back on the road. And that set off these series of road trips together. And Chris, do you want to talk about kind of the arc of the road trips?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, to your point, Tony, I did cut my teeth on our arguments about everything from God to how many wins the 49ers will have next year. So thank you for preparing me for these things. But yeah, I mean, so after that first road trip, we were so impressed by how powerful it is to be on the road, both in terms of the arcs your conversations can have, going from anger to understanding to apology to greater understanding to more anger and continue that cycle, that virtuous cycle in many ways, but also the beauty of the country. And so we decided, let's do this again. Let's see if there's a chance that we can get out there and learn something and maybe bring back something that would be important to say. So on that second road trip, we ended up going to we started at a Trump rally is really the the heart of that second road trip. And We had no idea what was happening. I saw it on my phone the day before. I sort of casually said, "Jordan, do you want to go check out this Trump rally?" And of course, Jordan said, "Absolutely." What an opportunity to see, the heart of our politics. And I, of course, immediately regretted the idea, but we decided to do it nonetheless. And we were both blown away by how we saw the same things. Whether we were inside the rally or outside, we would, turn to one another and whisper, like, "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, I heard that." And we would interpret it the same way. We were both, inspired by the activity outside and pulled back from the violence inside. We were amazed by the president's ability to move his flock, to move the people there. But we were both a little nervous by people at the edges of that rally. And the simple fact that we were able to see the world through the same set of eyes at such a fractious political moment made us go, I think we have a voice here. I think there's something we can say together. But because of the street violence that we saw that night, because of the anger, the vitriol, the inability to actually get beyond the veneer of difference and actually talk, inspired us to go out and try to find stories that were outside of politics, that spoke to more universal values, that spoke to ideas that might bond Jordan and I together and maybe the country as well, if we were able to get our stories out. So from there, we turned to trying to identify values and stories that might get us there. So we spent time with a group of veterans who run a gun range in Page, Arizona. We spent time with Pete, a truck driver who took us from Las Vegas to Slidell, Louisiana. And from there, we did all kinds of things that we found exciting, from spending a couple days on a lobster trawler to rehearsing King Lear with a group of inmates at Parnell Prison outside Detroit, all with the intent of finding stories that speak to a larger purpose, a different kind of value set.
I love that. So you started to allude to this. Obviously, the book is very much about your friendship. And it sort of excellently captures that, but it's also really enriched by these unique characters that Chris started to speak to, whether it's the Trump diehard, a trucker, community activist, a prisoner. I imagine you met hundreds, if not more, just incredible people who told incredible stories. Having not written a book, and like most of the audience, probably not written a book, just sort of wondering if you can give us a little bit of a view into the writer's process of what made you choose these characters over others? What jumped out about their stories? What were you hoping to illuminate by sharing their perspectives?
Yeah, each story was slightly different, and they all the stories we chose to tell spoke to both realizations on Jordan and I's part, as well as something about the country. So, for example, we spent a lot of time with Pete, the truck driver, who we sort of went in intending to tell a story about blue collar work, about what it's like to be on the road as a trucker in America today. And of course, we got to tell that story. But what ended up emerging in conversations with Pete is really how complicated Americans can be underneath the surface. So Pete, showed up on day one wearing a "Make America Great Again" shirt. And of course, my first thought was so much for getting away from politics. But we found him to actually be quite a complicated thinker. The first thing he said about politics was, I wish the president talked more about climate change. He talked about how God is love, and therefore he has to support LGBTQ marriage in a way that he didn't not that long before. We started to see that there's more to this country and the people on the road than meets the eye at first. And at the same time, Jordan and I were able to sort of, come together and talk about things like regulation, corporate control of truck driving, the importance of dignity and telling dignified stories. And so, that was just one example. And then everyone else in the book kind of has a sort of animating value to the story, as well as a kind of takeaway from what we learned spending time with these people. Jordan, do you have anything to add on that front?
Yeah, so one thing that was really important to us was that we weren't writing about these people because we thought they were stand-ins for something or some trend. We met people on the road, often serendipitously. There was no like real intention behind like finding these people. It was all just lucky. And what ended up happening was they had a big impact on our lives, and they taught us something deep. And so often when we're writing, we're just trying to share that because they were so important to us that we wanted to capture that and share it with others. And so as you go through the book, they're these amazing people, and we're so excited to get to share those stories. But we didn't select them because like, oh, it's like the Trump supporter, and then it's the other friend. They were just great people who really had a big impact on us.
Oh, that's great. So in a moment, this is a statement to the audience. In a moment, I'd love to start bringing in audience questions. So please feel free to send questions using the chat function. I think you'll see on your screen, it says ask a question. And then you could type in questions you have either about what we're talking about now or just general questions about the book. And then we'd love to start to weave those in throughout the conversation. So maybe turning now to my next question. In the book, you use a third-person narrative, and you often describe yourselves in many ways as representatives of your respective tribes or camps, which I thought was really interesting. So Chris, the liberal, Jordan, the conservative. I found that really illuminating in the sense that it made me think about why these arguments often can feel very heated, because you're no longer just sort of personally representing yourself, you're representing an entire movement or a community, and that's really difficult and becomes very animated very quickly, sometimes in ways you don't hope for. So I'm wondering if you could take a moment and think about your various camps and some of the more prominent voices within those camps, or the wings or factions, as sort of the media likes to kind of use to highlight our polarization as a country. And then I'm wondering maybe if you could tell us something that you discovered on these journeys that these groups within your various camps get wrong about the other side. So Chris, I'll start with you. If you were talking to AOC or the squad, what would you say she doesn't understand about Jordan that you'd like to share about this friend from sort of the other camp or the other tribe? Absolutely.
I think what really struck me, and I hate to out you here, Jordan, but on the road, it always felt like Jordan and the conservatives that he spends time with do actually care about progress. They might not be progressives, but they want everyone to have health care. They want everyone to get a good education. They don't like the criminal justice system as it exists today, in Jordan's telling, but they approach it very differently. And in the way Jordan and I would talk about all of these issues, we would often fight until we were blue in the face. And then sometimes we would end with, and so I guess we agree. And then one of us would say, yes, I guess we do. And the idea here is that if we want the same ends, then we can talk about the means to get there. And I think that's really important. And that's one of our big takeaways, is that there are quite a few shared values around this country that we all agree upon. Like we believe in second chances, for example, or many of us agree upon. We believe in second chances. And so when Jordan and I talk about criminal justice, it was very clear that we just needed to figure out the way to that end. And I think that that's something that gets lost in the mix sometimes. And, I think on the national scale, it's much harder to talk about these things. But knowing Jordan quite well, I can tell you that he's pursuing the same values and the same hopes and dreams that I am when I'm thinking about policy. And I think that's a really powerful starting point. So Jordan, I hope you're not too mad at me for saying that.
Yeah, Jordan. Same question to you. What does the MAGA community get wrong about this?
Well, first, thank you, Chris. That was, I think, very well said. So anytime I talk to my friends who are big MAGA supporters, I always tell them that Chris only whines half as much as they think he does. Quite as bad as they think. I think one of the perceptions on the right, especially some of the more like kind of red meat, like throwing hard right, is that the left, and especially the progressive left, that they in some way they loathe America, that they have this deep disdain for it. They're always looking to kind of tear it down in some sense. And spending so much time on the road with Chris, I think what I learned about his perspective, and for most of those on the left, is that that in fact they do love America deeply, and they love it for the values it espouses and the ideals and principles that are enshrined in our founding documents and in our civic religion. And what they're generally calling for is for us to live up to those values. And they have a deep concern and empathy for those who've been left out and continue to be left out today. And so as Chris and I talked, we found that that he often responded to things I said that seemed to minimize the challenges that people have faced, especially certain marginalized communities through history and today. He would respond aggressively because he has a deep passion for those communities and ensuring that they do have the rightful place in the American tapestry. And once I came to really understand how deep that love was, it becomes much easier because now we're talking about shared values, shared ground, things that we both care deeply about. And while we might have different languages for it, that's an easy thing for us to engage on.
That's great. Maybe sticking with this theme, I'm really interested in like sort of the converse of this, and maybe I'll start with you, Jordan. I'm wondering if you could be sort of honest and maybe even a bit vulnerable. What is a criticism that you hear from the left that is lobbed sort of towards your camp that deep down inside you sort of agree is something that we actually probably ought to work on as a party or as a sort of political ideology? And I would ask, of course, the same question of Chris. You know, what is one of those things that I know, especially in this day and age, it's really hard to admit, you know, because in many ways they sort of feel like life and death struggles. And if I cede any ground on anything, you know, that's a sign of weakness, and I can't do that. So just sort of curious if there are things that you'd say internally, yeah, we ought to do a better job of that, and we could, you know, we should aspire to be better on this particular issue or this way of going about things.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are specific policy areas that I think the Republican Party, like I wish they would take a different stance. But I think as kind of a meta point, I think the Republican Party and the conservative movement has a really hard time articulating desired end goals. Like they have a really hard time saying, we want all Americans to have healthcare, or we want every kid to have the best quality education possible, or we want a society in which everybody has a minimum standard of living that includes, you know, enough to have essentially living wage. And I think the reason they can't articulate those things is because they think in doing so, they admit the means must be government spending. And so they have this aversion to doing it, even though every conservative I know actually does care about those things. And yet it makes them come off, it makes the Republicans and conservatives come off as deeply unempathetic when you can't say things like, of course every American should have great healthcare. And so I wish Republicans would get much better about articulating the ends we want, because that's actually where we do share a lot of the progressive movement. There's a ton of overlap there. And if we could just articulate those ends, I think it would be easier to disagree over means in a productive way and say like, okay, we might not agree on like your approach versus mine, but like where in the middle can we get to so we can at least move the ball forward towards the end we both share.
Chris, same question. Things that you'd sort of say that sort of the liberal camp could be better on and might want to do a little soul searching around.
Yeah, one that comes to mind largely because Jordan and I have talked at length about it is a more nuanced understanding of tradition. I think that there are a lot of really powerful elements of the American tradition that we really need to embrace, whether that is the sort of democratic founding ideals, the system as it was designed. Of course, there are deep flaws in that system and that remain today, have been made worse over time. And we do a lot of talking or writing in Union about how we wrestle with history. But there are a lot of elements of our history that are really quite important to hold on to, even while we change monuments, we change names. We can't let go of where we've come from in a lot of senses. And I think also I was primed to hear this message from Jordan, especially over the last few years, because I consider myself an Obama liberal. And I don't, I was just listening. I was listening again to his eulogy for John Lewis. And he talks about these things. He talks about redeeming the American idea. He talks about living up to the American creed and our original founding, whether it's like liberty, freedom, pursuit of happiness. I mean, these are important ideas that we don't want to lose track of. And I think that more and more we're losing our ability on the left. We're losing our ability to talk about the amazing parts of this country alongside the difficult parts.
That's a great point. So we actually have our first question from a member of the audience, and I'd encourage folks to continue to send in great questions and share that. one of the questions that we have from Alexis is actually around this idea of, have you shared sort of a similar discussion, or have you arranged a similar discussion for members of Congress? Maybe I'll open that question a little more broadly, but ask if there are lessons that you wish you could sort of share directly with our national leaders or members of Congress. In many ways, the book talks about the role that the media plays. And I wonder if you have sort of advice for our national leaders and the role that they play in helping to maintain some of the polarization, amplify some of the polarization in ways that perhaps aren't healthy or helpful for the national dialogue.
Yeah, I think our national leaders bear a lot of blame for the state of polarization. I think they have found that it's easier to raise money and activate your base when you're slinging red meat at them instead of kind of finding ways to move forward. And I find it very distressing that in the midst of the pandemic, we still can't even seem to get to a shared compromise over bills to help Americans. And I think that the two lessons that I would offer to our politicians is, first, that time together really matters. Like, Chris and I were able to have these amazing conversations because we built this deep foundation of trust, so that when I said something that Chris might have questioned in early in our relationship, might have wondered ooh, does this person have values that I might not be able to associate with? We had so much built up trust that I knew he would take it with good faith, and that he in turn wouldn't judge me for views I had. And it took time to get there, but once we did, we could have incredibly productive conversations about where on these very hard issues we did have alignment. And we often found that the disagreements between us were much smaller than we had initially thought. It's the way our parties talk about issues that drive us apart, but really, we're actually pretty close together. So they need to spend more time together, and maybe that means getting a group together, the same group every week, week over week, so that you do build those bonds. And then I think the second thing I would offer is, everywhere we went across the country, there was this deep desire for common ground, for a better message, for more unity, for a politician who could bring us together. And Chris and I actually just found a study conducted by this group called More in Common that was asking questions in June about the public's perception of government and how it's handling various issues in American life. And it was just one question after another. The responses were less faith in government, less trust in this aspect of our institutions or that aspect. But you get to the last page, on the 6th page, buried at the bottom, it said, do you want a leader who can bring the country back together? And it was 94% said yes. And then the next question was, do you think we should be Americans before partisans? And it was 96% said yes. And so my view to politicians is, the country actually wants this. And if you're able to bring an inspiring message about bringing people together, to finding common ground, to solve our biggest issues, that would resonate with the American people, I think, far more than in these narrowly tailored polemic messages.
Mm-hmm. Chris, maybe a similar question. Any lessons or advice you'd have for our national leaders or members of Congress, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first thing I would say is that Union is our effort to collect stories from outside of the bright lights. So we went out and we talked to people in New Orleans and Portland and South Dakota and not so much DC. But I think that actually gives us some sort of insight into maybe how DC can change. And what I would only add one wrinkle to something that Jordan said. Otherwise, I just completely concur with him. And that's just to say, on top of spending more time together, I think it's really important that we spend different time together. I think that context is very important. I often think about Pete, the truck driver, and I think about if I had met him at the Trump rally, we probably wouldn't have been able to talk whatsoever. We would have been yelling, or we would have not given each other any notice. It just would not have been conducive to conversation. But when it's 9 p.m., the sun's just gone down, maybe Jordan's snoozing in the back, maybe he's not. When the two of us are talking, then we're far more able to talk about more human things. You sort of naturally, in that sort of intimate context, try to find that connective tissue that makes you, puts you in the same species. And I think there's something really powerful about that. And I think that at least my time in DC, I didn't spend any of that kind of intimate time with the other side, so to speak. And I think with the Hill, national leaders, state leaders, there needs to be context for quiet, vulnerable, intimate settings to talk, whether that's over a beer or whether that's dinner at one another's houses. And I know that doesn't seem like a grand change, like a change that's going to fix our politics overnight. But I think that losing that is very, very detrimental to our ability to communicate, and it makes it that much easier to get in front of the cameras, the C-SPAN cameras on the floor, and say whatever the heck you want, because you haven't broken bread with the other side. You don't know who they are when you get away from the bright lights, and I think that's critical. A critical part of spending more time together is spending it in that different context.
Yeah, I think you're right, and both of you have alluded to this, the lack of sort of knowledge and familiarity that our, particularly members of Congress and senators, have with one another. Shorter election cycles mean that you have to immediately get back to the district and campaign and fundraise and do all of those things, which means less time actually sharing a meal, spending time with one another, just getting to know one another and building that kind of trust. I think Senator Lindsey Graham speaks incredibly highly of his friend Joe Biden, because it seems as though they built a real, enduring, trusting relationship that I would imagine these are two people who could find common ground and work out some of our issues or some of the things. There's actually a bit of a follow-up question. So a commenter mentioned that you've mentioned sort of shared meals. They're wondering, are there other sort of communal experiences that forge friendship that we can use to replicate, and build sort of national experience, build community in deeper ways that we can replicate elsewhere in our daily lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think two other things that we noticed on the road that were really powerful for building community. One of them was rituals, and while we often think about those in the context of religion, I think there are many ways to have shared rituals in small groups and communities and among friends. And there's something about creating this sort of sacred space for a ritual where it's separate from everyday life. You're purposefully going to come together, and you do so regularly. That just really bonds people together. There's something extremely powerful about it. And once you have that, it's very easy to expand it. Strong communities are generous and they welcome in the outsider. And Chris and I found that strong communities are built on those shared rituals. So I think that's something that can be really powerful. And today, with the ability to connect virtually over long distances, I think we can actually create these shared rituals that are powerful. And then another that really struck us as being able to bring people together and break down barriers was music. And there's just something about music that when two people are listening to it together, it's almost a little bit spiritual and hokey, but like you resonate at a similar wavelength. You're able to tap into this more transcendent feeling. And as one musician in New Orleans told us, there's nothing dualistic about music. Like you can approach it and come at it and love it from any direction. And that's great. All that matters is that you do. And so I think there's really something special about music. I don't know how you kind of take that and scale it into a way to bring people together, but Chris and I found that it was very powerful for us.
Yeah, I want our audience to note that the conservative was the first one to bring up spirituality, so not the Berkeley liberal. I mean, this might not be scalable either, but I do think it was important out on the road, and I think it's also a little bit self-indulgent. But storytelling, I think storytelling is really brilliantly important. Listening to Pete or listening to Gabriel, one of the inmates at Parnell Prison, listening to his poetry and his life story, or listening to Mimi, who runs a drug diversion program in Tulsa for women and mothers, tell the story of both her program and the women in the program. It spawns empathy. I mean, we are truly wired for story. The way to get across an idea that is uncomfortable or a life experience that is unknown or foreign to us is to tell it in story. And when we were able to be around a campfire and telling stories, or in the truck telling stories, or listening to the beep of correctional officers outside in a room talking about Shakespeare and story, you're actually able to connect in a totally different way, in a totally new way. So storytelling generally might not be the answer, but storytelling to other people, to people that might not otherwise hear your story, I think that's also sort of an important way to get this across.
No, it's really powerful. I think one of the things that immediately comes to mind, maybe to Jordan's point, is sports. I've also found is very much a common bond. If you can't talk about politics or something, but you can usually talk about what happened with a local event or sports, the Super Bowl, whatever it may be.
Speaking of which, we have a lot to talk about, Tony. We have a lot to talk about on the Niners and everything else, but we'll save that for offline.
We certainly do. Well, these have been great questions, by the way, to the audience. I just encourage you to keep on sending those in. This is great. So we really appreciate that. So please keep on sending those in, and we'll get to those. Maybe I'll turn back to something that kind of I've been thinking a lot about, actually, even since before the book came out, when I knew you guys were writing this book. But I think most of us can agree, and you guys have talked about it already, that there's a real benefit in coming together, hashing through our differences, and arriving at compromise solutions for the good of the country or for the sake of progress. We absolutely need to do that. And there's a wide range of issues that we can do that with, but we're also confronted with a range of issues where compromise doesn't really feel like an option. So particularly if one side or the other views it in really stark binary choices. So for example, if I am a pro-life person, I can't compromise on ending the life of a child, right? That's how they view it. If I am a transgender service member, and we're now literally talking about my right to serve in the military, we're taking the right of service away from somebody who has, frankly, should be allowed to serve openly, right, with respect. That's how they feel. And so my question is, are there circumstances when compromise is actually not the answer? Or do you believe that there is always an opportunity to find common ground in every circumstance? Maybe we'll start with Jordan on that question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So one thing that Chris and I came to believe over the course of the book is that common ground isn't getting to agreement. It's about getting to the point where disagreement isn't reason to break away from each other. And we found over time that we weren't convincing each other of our sides, but we were getting to the point where we could articulate our side, and the other person could empathize, and they can understand and engage with it. And so that's the argument of the book, is like, how do we get to that point? And I think one of the incredible things about the system of American governance is that we've built it so that we're not always going to agree on substance. There are certain issues that we're always just going to be deeply divided on. I think abortion is probably like the archetypal one. But we all agree to a process by which we're going to just hash this out, and we can keep hashing it out over time. And so the belief in the process is actually one of the virtues of the American system, and it allows us to live together even when we disagree viscerally on these issues. And that's true for the vast majority of people and issues. Now, I think there are some that that process breaks down, and obviously slavery and the Civil War is the best example. There are some things that are just they have such moral force and weight that the process just can't work or can't function. And I think when we come across those issues, that's where our society kind of goes to extra constitutional means. And we also have this great tradition and legacy of doing that, where it becomes part of the American ethos that when things do reach such a moral weight, that we can actually transcend that process, but then come back to it. And so I think my belief is that there are very few issues where that can't be true, but where they are, I think the moral weight is judged by history, and to date, America has been on the right side of that. So, Chris, what do you think?
Well, I'd say you put it pretty damn well, friend. But what I would add is that common ground is our project, but I don't know if it's everyone's project. And I'd like to think it should be more people's project than it is right now. But there's always going to be people who maybe don't want to do this. And we also like to say that it takes all types to create an open society. So there might not be those who want to do this, but I think that the vast majority of Americans or any citizen who lives in a democracy, that dialogue, even if common ground isn't possible, that dialogue is important. And that's why we came to this sort of new definition of common ground. Not that we all have to be in lockstep on an issue, but that we need to talk about them nonetheless. That we need to be, and I know this is a word that elicits a lot of feelings, but like we need to be civil often, and sometimes we don't. But I think in most cases, friendship trumps anger when it comes to getting somewhere. And whether we like it or not, like this country is made up of millions of both sides. So it's also just a necessity of modern democratic life. 60 plus million people voted for Trump, 60 plus million people voted for Hillary Clinton. We won't get into the specifics, but that's a lot of people on both sides, and a lot of people didn't vote there. And so that what it means here is that there's lots and lots of us. And if we can't talk, even if we disagree on issues, then we can't get anywhere, and then we can't make progress, and then everyone loses. So I do hope that this is a project that will grow, even if I don't believe it's going to be everyone's project ultimately.
Yeah. I think I'll take a little bit of moderator privilege and add, I think maybe to Jordan's point, that it's really incredibly important that we also ensure that we safeguard access to the vote. It's just incredibly important that there be healthy civil outlets to disagreeing in productive ways, and maintaining access to the right to vote is just incredibly important from that perspective. So maybe we'll turn to another audience question that I think is actually kind of interesting, and maybe it's related to our earlier talk a little bit about points to national leaders, or even on this one around compromise. But what historical figures do you feel have been particularly effective at reaching across the aisle or reaching across political divides to find common ground?
Mm-hmm. It's so funny that question just came up. I was about to say in response to Tony's point that one of my favorite speeches, and one that Chris and I listened to on the road, and we talk about in the book, is Malcolm X's Ballot or the Bullet, where he's basically framing that choice, that if the ballot isn't working, the other option is the bullet. And so it presents this stark choice for society, basically making the case that the ballot must be the primary way of doing things, and the access to it must be unfettered. And Chris's point in return was that he thought Martin Luther King's speech was actually better. We were comparing which speech was better, I Have a Dream or Ballot or the Bullet. But I think Martin Luther King is by far, to me, the best example of someone who's able to speak and find the language that can have broad appeal in order to foster common ground across sides. And I think the way he did it was he articulated his message within the tradition of American history. And so he holds up the best of America and says, these are our ideals. They are incredible ideals. And now I'm just asking for those ideals to be extended to this community, which has been left out. And I think that ability to speak from within the thing that people love and care about, to use the identity that people hold so dear, and then to show how what is in reality is out of step with that identity, is a very powerful way of forging common purpose. To me, he's the greatest example of the modern era.
Chris, an inspiring political figure or historical figure that sort of bridges the divides.
Absolutely. And in the spirit of union, I also want to point out that the first person on this call to bring up Malcolm X in a positive sense was the conservative. So just, things are more complicated than they may look. I would have said MLK. Largely speaking, I think that to echo something Jordan just said, there is an opportunity to tell stories again that reframe the sort of founding ideals for the moment. And something Jordan and I often agree on and have said often is that politics is always going to be fractious because it is a competition. Someone wins, someone loses. And I do honestly believe that. But I do think that there's every once in a while people who can get beyond that, who can tell a much larger story, and who can change the way we look at the country and our future. And MLK was certainly one of them. Kennedy, both of the Kennedys in my mind, was one of them. Reagan, I think, was also someone who was able to sort of speak a larger truth about America, no matter what we think of him as a president. And I think that I would sort of point to maybe, MLK for sure. I would also say Kennedy, since in the spirit of giving two names here.
No problem. That's great. Thanks very much, guys. So again, audience, I'd encourage you to keep on sending in these great questions. It's really a lot of fun to hear your perspectives and what you're thinking about. So we'll turn back to a portion of the book where it appears you two had a pretty tough conversation. One of the ones where you sort of both said you're probably red in the face by the end of it. And this is sort of the tough conversation you all had about race and police brutality. In that, Jordan highlighted failures of leadership and the risks associated with being a police officer. Chris, you share a pretty vivid recounting of an incident that was a pretty clear racial profiling of one of your friends. When Chris described that experience of a black friend, in this case, being singled out and pulled from the car, I personally had a very visceral reaction knowing what it feels like to encounter a police officer and recognize that, no, this is a potentially life or death situation. And that is true as a teen, and that is true for me today as a 40-year-old man. And so knowing that, it made me really think a lot more about, the importance of empathy and actually sort of understanding that sort of shared or different experience. So I wanted to sort of think about how do we move beyond sort of surface level conversations about topics like race and gender and sexual orientation and religion. So maybe my question is what advice do you have for audiences on doing a better job of learning more about the perspectives of others, particularly on topics where it may be difficult to understand another's perspective or to really sort of put yourself in someone else's shoes in a way that's pretty effective? So maybe I'll start with Chris on this question.
Yeah. It's a hard question, and it's Jordan and I to this day still fight about things. We were just laughing earlier on the phone today about a fight we had yesterday. So this is a messy process, and this is to understand one another on ideas and issues that are so core to so many Americans. It can be really, really difficult, and so that goes to Jordan's point about coming back to the table. I think we are at our best, Jordan and I, when we're talking about these difficult things and when we're trying to find empathy, when we're starting with shared values, when we're identifying values that maybe are competing, but that we both agree upon. So for example, actually in the voting space, we've often tried to talk about voter ID laws or, the way the franchise should be legislated. And when we talk about Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, we often find ourselves red in the face and fighting. But when we're able to start with things like, we both believe in the franchise. We both believe that everyone needs the vote and should have access to it. Like Jordan was just saying, the bullet or the ballot box, or the vice versa. And on the opposite side, we all believe in a modicum of security. We care about making sure that the Russian intelligence operation can't interfere in our elections. That Facebook is not used to change everything about outcomes. These are big problems, and ultimately, on a value perspective, we agree on both of these things. And then we're far more able to talk about outcomes or policies or where we should go with something. I think that's one aspect of our conversation that has been really helpful towards talking about really difficult things. I don't want to bogart all of our lessons here. Jordan, do you want to throw one in?
Yeah, sure. I like the way you framed the question, Tony, where I think what Chris and I found is that as we're having these arguments, those arguments are informed by these emotional experiences that we hold and what we're bringing to these conversations. And yet that emotion is often beneath the surface. And instead, we use data that we bring to the table, or we bring anecdotes that we try to share. And those conversations just end up being this kind of tit for tat. I marshal my data, you marshal yours, and we're never going to agree. And because we're locked into this intent to kind of change the other person's mind, that emotion boils over into anger. And I think what Chris and I found over time is that we could have better conversations when we were able to share what those underlying experiences or emotions were. And by doing so from different identities that really matter to us. So if I kind of drop the Republican label and I'm able to talk as a Marine who experienced a certain amount of shared danger, I know what it feels like to go into uncertain situations. I have a lot of empathy for someone put in that position and what it might feel like for a police officer who approaches a car in an uncertain situation and is afraid for their life and they just want to go home. Chris can feel kind of the empathy and emotion that I have and why I'm approaching the issue in that way. And then vice versa, when Chris can talk about his personal experiences and watching friends who are profiled, racially profiled, or experiencing what it's like to be in a situation where it gets dangerous with a police officer, I have a lot more empathy for how he's approaching the issue. And that doesn't mean either of us are right. It doesn't mean that those experiences have any necessary bearing on what policy should be, but it does help us understand like where we're coming from in these arguments so that we can then have productive conversations about, okay, well, like how can we think about a way to make community police relations better, knowing the kind of experiences we both hold, the emotions we have, and now the facts and data we can bring to the table. That led to much more productive conversations.
No, it's great. Maybe keeping on this topic just a little bit more, we're beginning to have what feels like I would say a sort of a much needed reckoning on race. It's the beginning of a long overdue national conversation on this topic. And so I'm wondering if this particular moment makes you optimistic about the future, and does your experience from the road suggest that we're ready to have this type of national conversation? Maybe I'll start with Jordan.
Yeah, it's a great question. So going into the book and on these road trips, I think the biggest difference between Kristen and me is that I was an optimist about the country. I thought we would find positive signs for America everywhere, that we would just see person after person who was good, that we would see signs of vibrancy everywhere. And Chris was more of a skeptic, where based on kind of the news and the tenor of our politics, he thought we would just witness America coming apart. And I think a lot of that tension was driven by kind of the underlying socioeconomic and racial issues that we were hearing about and our own perspectives coming into them. And what we found on the road was we started to see things the same way. It's going from community to community. Chris saw a lot of the things that were driving my optimism. He did see that everywhere we went, there were good people, that there were signs of vibrancy. And I saw signs of trouble. I saw racial issues. I saw issues with the criminal justice system, drug addiction. It's hard to witness and not walk away thinking like we have these very deep structural problems. And I think this all came together for us in Tulsa, which is a very formative experience for Chris and I, where we arrived in Tulsa. We had never heard of the Tulsa race massacre in 1921. And this was back 3-4 years ago, where most of the country didn't know about this because it's a story that just has been suppressed. It's not really viewed as part of the American history, story, and tradition. And so it's just not talked about. And what we also found in Tulsa, though, like despite this very deep, challenging racial history, and in one that has legacies and ramifications today, we saw incredibly hardworking, good, decent people working so hard to bring both that story into the present and to make it a part of Tulsa's shared history, and to work to overcome the current challenges by first having a conversation about that. And the fact that they were having this conversation, they were doing it across the city, that people from all parties and all sides were engaged in it, and that they were so hopeful about how they could have a better future together, I think left Chris and I very hopeful. And so one pastor there named Jamal, who was kind of leading the effort, said to us that progress begins with having hard conversations, that we can't move forward until we've talked about what's been. And so he was hopeful because those conversations were now happening. And I think as we look across the country and see a lot more conversation about our history and how those scars affect us today, I think Chris, I won't speak for Chris, but I'm very hopeful, and the message of our book is hopeful.
Yeah, I'll turn it to you, Chris. Are we ready for this national conversation?
Jordan, you're welcome to talk for me when you're talking like that. So thank you. But yeah, I think so. And just to underline something Jordan said earlier, we finished writing this book on July 4th, 2019. We reported it between 2015 and 2019. So this is well before this current moment that we're in. And it was unavoidable on the road. Talking about race, talking about inequality, talking about how to create a more perfect union along those lines. And so I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing that outpouring of readiness, of anger in some cases, and desire to change. And I think that's really powerful. And when you look at our streets right now, this moment is born of terrible tragedy, but it is so optimistic in that this is now the biggest social movement in U.S. history. If you look at the statistics, it doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal, you care about human dignity, you care about equality. Jordan and I had a call shortly after the murder of George Floyd, and I was a little nervous about the call because I was so ruined by what I saw on that tape. And I just didn't want to get into a fight. And I answered the phone, and the first thing Jordan said was, that was inhumane, that was heinous, something needs to change immediately, which is of course what he would say. And I think that yes, both of us are hopeful, because we believe that hope is an active form of optimism. That if people aren't in the streets, if people aren't caring about these things, if people aren't having these hard conversations and working tooth and nail to change them, to better our country, then there is no hope. But when they are, there's more hope than you can possibly imagine. And I often return, especially lately, to the words of John Lewis and especially his memorial service. And I can't think of anyone more hopeful than that man. And I think that part of his legacy is what we're seeing in the streets today. And we're seeing people pushing so hard. And I think it's going to take a long time for it to trickle up to Washington potentially, which goes to our earlier conversation about the ways things need to change there. But I think if you look at our streets and you talk to the same people that we talk to across this country, you can't help but be hopeful that this tragedy will turn into something beautiful.
Excellent. I appreciate that. So I know we're sort of nearing the end of our time together, but we've got a couple more good questions. Maybe we could sort of speak to them quickly. So in the book, you speak to the beauty of the American landscape. How can we use that shared love of the American landscape to sort of bridge political divide? I know, Chris, you're an avid bird watcher, an award-winning one, in fact. But sort of curious, like you spent a lot of time on the road. You saw the beauty that this country has to offer. I had a similar experience. I cycled from Outer Banks, North Carolina to San Diego, California. And it's just an incredible country that we live in. We're really blessed in that sense. How did the actual sort of landscape shape your views, affect how you felt about the country coming out of this?
So I'll answer quickly, and then I would love to hear Chris as the resident birdwatcher. His view. So there's actually the first true American artistic movement is called tonalism, and it emerged when soldiers from the Civil War, dealing with trauma, went out into the American wilderness and used it to heal. And I think there is something incredibly healing about the American landscape. And when you're staring at this beautiful vista next to someone you just had an all-out fight with, there's something about it that just calms you down and allows you to return to a state of tranquility. It's really special. And Chris and I think at one point talked about how we wish there could be almost a birthright for America. So birthright for Israel is any Jewish person can get a free trip to Israel when they're under 26. And how great would it be if we had that for America, where there was something for every American kid to get to see some of the national parks and see what has inspired generations of Americans given its beauty. So I think there's something incredible.
It's a brilliant idea, Jordan. We should take it back to work with us. Chris, go
ahead. Tony's playing chess here. I see. No, I prefer competitive birdwatcher, by the way, not award-winning competitive. All right. Yes, I agree with everything Jordan just said. I would only add that, and I learned this from my mother, that there's few places more American than an open place. I think that democracy requires us to come together and be in a place to talk. And often in history, that has been public squares, parks. I think that there's nothing more American in our politics than saving land. I mean, Trump just did it a few days ago, signing land into public trust for perpetuity. I think that it's just core to who we are as citizens and as speakers. And so not only is it this great tonic to pain and conflict, but it also is just just to have it is part and parcel of building democracy. So this really was driven home to us at a place called the Gathering Place in Tulsa, which is a massive park right on the banks of the Arkansas River. And it was designed specifically with the segregated nature of Tulsa in mind, where they wanted to bring North and South Tulsa together. And so they built it on that line. And it was supposed to be a place where everyone can come and see one another and talk to one another and hold events and grow. And so I think that, whether it's Yellowstone or a park in the Lower East Side, you have to have open places. You have to have public spaces in order to build a thriving open society.
That's a great point. So I'm going to maybe do one more audience question, then we'll close with another question from me. But so the question is from Julia Brady. It's a question of whether either of you wants to run for political office. I will add an addendum to this question and say, having learned the lessons you have about compromise, how could either of you justify not running for office? If the answer is no.
Well, I can quickly go first and say I doubt it for myself. I prefer to work for politicians. That's actually how I met Tony, who was a wonderful boss back. Wow, was that over a decade ago? I think that was over a decade
ago. Yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah, I'm inspired by others, is what I would say. But Jordan, what about you? What do you think?
Well, I think it is an incredibly noble thing to run for office. I have so much respect for Tony for doing it. I hope it's something that most people keep open because it is a public service, and service is really important. Our country depends on it. I think the book tour experience has taught me that I'm actually not great going out and talking to people all the time. So I don't know.
Disagree. No, that's a great point. I appreciate that, guys. Keeping on the topic of running for office, we're entering into we are well in the midst of a presidential election cycle, which is arguably our most polarized time as a nation. Unfortunately, these election cycles are getting longer and longer, and you got about 18 months to be president before you're starting to run for president again. And I think we all know how the media plays into that, how our sort of tribalism comes out in all of those different ways. So I'm just wondering if there are salient moments from the book that you think are relevant for this national moment, and advice that you give to the audience for navigating conversations as we lead up to the presidential election.
I think my advice to the country, based on the book, is that the next 2-3 months is going to be divisive. There's no doubt about it. That's the nature of political elections, and we can wage that fight against each other in good faith and recognize that the other side isn't all the worst things that we label them, and that the day after we have to come back together. We're stuck together. There's no doubt that going forward, in order to solve problems, we have to work together. And so, to the extent we can move into November 4th with the attitude of reconciliation, of coming back to the table, as Chris always says, we'll be better off, and not go in with this vindictive attitude that I'm now going to use the power I have to punch the other side. But let's find ways of working together. Let's recognize that we're still one country, we're still one people. I think we'll be better for it.
Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would of course agree with everything Jordan just said. I would only add, well, actually, for the three of us, I think the best place for us to end is in New Orleans. I know this is an important place for both Jordan and myself, as well as Tony. In fact, Tony and I bonded early over our love of New Orleans, post-Katrina New Orleans in particular. And the reason I would point to New Orleans is because here's a place that has built a culture specifically on bringing together other cultures, whether it's Caribbean culture, French culture, American culture, Afro-Cuban culture, slave culture, every kind of culture imaginable, and creating art forms that are universally, or that are remarkably American and speak to universal emotion, that has difficult histories and often complicated and painful, both modern and deeper history, and is able to sort of exercise it through means other than or through means like music and art and getting together and food and building sort of hybrid cultures that are uniquely American. And so I'd say as we look forward, let's take that message of reconciliation, of coming together, of seeing one another and listening to one another, that is so alive in a place like New Orleans, and hopefully take that with us to the ballot box.
That is a beautiful place to end. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is called Union. I believe there's a link available for you all in the chat where you could purchase the book. Jordan and Chris, thank you so much for your time, for writing such an inspiring piece of work, and for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you so much, Tony.
Such a good moderator. We really appreciate it, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. Chris, Jordan, Tony, thank you so much. That was an incredible discussion. If you'd like to buy their book, remember the green button down there. You can go ahead and click it. That's it. Thank you all so much. And have a good night.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.